Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Captain Patriotic. How's everybody doing today? As you'll recall last time, we continued our most decorated veterans for World War I series. And in that particular episode, if you did not see it, we discussed in great detail the most decorated U.S. Navy sailor to serve during World War I and beyond, actually. That honor went to Rear Admiral Joel Thomas Boone, where he served over 35 years in the Navy during both World War I as well as World War II, and then went on to serve for a little bit in Korea. That's a pretty impressive feat all on its own. His case was very, very special because, unlike a lot of Navy personnel that serve on naval ships for the United States, Rear Admiral Boone had the opportunity and was actually assigned to serve as basically like a combat medic or a combat surgeon with the U.S. Marines that were serving on the ground in Europe during World War I. Basically known today as a naval doctor or a Navy corpsman by today's standards. He earned the nation's highest honor in July of 1918 for going well and above the call of duty trying to rescue and treat wounded Marines during the Battle of the Marne of 1918. And he had a lot more decorations to his name too, which I go into a lot of great detail in the previous video. Long story short, he was and is still considered today to be the most decorated combat medic in the United States military history. And I think he more than deserves the honor of the most decorated Navy personnel during World War I. So, let's shift gears a little bit today because in honor of Veterans Day, which for those of you that may or may not know, Veterans Day originally was set to commemorate the ending of hostilities for World War I on November 11th, 1918, and when it was originally established as a holiday, that was meant to celebrate veterans of World War I. Well, then, soon after that, in the mid-20th century, you have veterans from World War II, Korea. In the later half of the 20th century, you have Vietnam, Desert Storm, and so forth, to where it was declared a national holiday for veterans from all wars, not just World War I. I know a lot of people know what Veterans Day is, and they celebrate it every year. But there is one particular holiday that I feel is underrated and under-celebrated for the most part, and that, my friends, is the United States Marine Corps birthday on November 10th, one day before the nationally acclaimed Veterans Day every year. I know a lot of people know about the Army, the Navy, the Air Force, and other military branches in our country, but in my personal opinion, I think the U.S. Marines are an underrated and sometimes underappreciated branch of the military. Basically, the Marine Corps serves as what a lot of people like to call our nation's 911, or fast-acting military force that can be deployed anywhere at any time. And they do a little bit of everything, from ground infantry to guarding bases, U.S. embassy bases around the world, to serving on Navy ships, to flying airplanes for infantry support. There's a lot of things that go on in the Marines. The Marine Corps was officially developed on November 10th, 1775 in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and its main purpose was to serve as a service branch of infantry troops that are capable of fighting both at sea and on shore. You know, the Marines, they fill a lot of roles, even as small as they are. In fact, the Marines are considered the Maritime Land Force service branch responsible for conducting expeditionary and ambiguous operations through combined arms, including its own infantry, artillery, aerial, and special operations forces. Basically, as I like to call it, the Marine Corps is basically like the foot soldiers for the U.S. Navy. So, in honor of both Veterans Day and the United States Marine Corps birthday, I have the pleasure of talking to you today about the most decorated combat Marine in U.S. history. That honor goes to none other than Colonel Chesty Puller. Now, some of you may or may not be familiar with the name, and that's okay. We're going to get into more detail here shortly. But he is a very, very iconic figure in the U.S. Marine Corps. In fact, he had a career that spanned almost 40 years from the time of World War I until the mid-1950s. And another interesting fact about Puller is that he is the only U.S. Marine to receive the second highest medal for combat, which is the Navy Cross, a record 5 times. 5 Navy Crosses for valor and bravery in combat. And he was also awarded an Army Distinguished Service Cross during Korea, bringing his total to 6 service crosses. I know that he doesn't have a Medal of Honor, but think about it. 6 service crosses, basically equating to the second highest and greatest military honor for bravery and valor in combat. That's pretty dang impressive in itself to get just one of those, but to get 6 of them like he did, to me, that's almost the equivalent of a Medal of Honor, or even 2 Medals of Honor for that matter. That's pretty dang impressive. So, without further ado, let's get into the life and legacy of this glorious U.S. Marine. Now, our story starts on June 26, 1898, whenever Louis Chesty Puller is born in West Point, Virginia. Now, when he grows up around the turn of the 20th century, he grew up on tales from aging veterans from the Civil War, both the Union and Confederate soldiers and any other veterans for that matter that served during the 19th century. So that quickly got him interested in eventually joining the military when he got older. Now, Puller kind of had a rough start as far as enlisting in the military because he originally wanted to join the U.S. Army in 1916 to go fight in Mexico. The only problem was he was not of legal age at the time to enlist on his own, and his mother would not sign the consent forms, which allowed him to enlist in the Army. So that was shelved in 1916. I know that Chesty was very furious about this, but he did not give up, though. Instead of enlisting in the Army and going to fight in Mexico, he decides to attend the Virginia Military Institute for a couple of years. Fast forward to 1918, the last year of World War I, he officially enlists in the United States Marine Corps, gaining a commission after the conflict was over and never having to leave the States. So he didn't get his wish to fight in a war from the get-go, but hey, he was able to enlist in perhaps one of the most badass military branches in our country. I will say, though, the first few years of him serving in the Marines was kind of uneventful, though, because he was ultimately, after World War I, relegated to the Marine Reserves, where he then resigned from the Marines and re-enlisted for active duty as a private for the chance to serve as a lieutenant in the Marine-led Gendarmerie during the U.S. occupation of Haiti during the Banana Wars. In 5 years, he fought a handful of small engagements against peasant chacos or guerrillas, failed his second stint as a Marine officer candidate, and finally gained a permanent commission on his third attempt in 1924. However, he would flunk out of flight school 2 years later in 1926. So, as you can see, it was kind of a rough start for him for the get-go. I guess he was kind of a reckless guy, kid, didn't know what exactly he wanted to do until he tried out many different things, you know. But anyway, fast forward to 1928, where Puller was deployed to Nicaragua as part of the U.S. effort to support the government of their president, Adolfo Diaz. While he was in Nicaragua, Puller spent his first 18 months as a frustrated staff officer, but eventually he made his initial mark commanding the only unit of the Marine-led Guardia Nacional that was not tethered to defending a town. Over the following years, his aggressive pursuit of Cesar Augusto Sandino's rebels led to numerous battles and him earning his first 2 Navy Crosses. His very first Navy Cross was actually awarded for being a part of 5 engagements with Caco bandits in 1930, and his second one was awarded in 1932 for helping lead him and his men during a counteroffensive during an ambush by the enemy. With 2 Navy Crosses to his name at that point, he had gained a reputation for fearlessness as well as the nickname Chesty. So, after spending 10 months undergoing advanced training at the U.S. Army Infantry School at Fort Benning, Georgia, Puller began a second tour of duty in Nicaragua in July of 1932, and on December 26, 1932, just 5 days before the end of the U.S. intervention, Puller led a Guardia unit in one of the biggest victories of the conflict during the Battle of El Sauz. After Chesty is finished in Nicaragua, his next assignment took him to China, where he would serve there from 1933 until 1936. While in China, he was in charge of the Marine detachment on the USS Augusta under Captain Chester Nimitz, and led the famed Horse Marines in Beijing, China. He was officially promoted to captain in February 1936 and returned to the United States later that year to begin a teaching assignment at the basic school, which basically, that was a training course designed for newly commissioned and appointed Marine officers. Now, his 3-year stint as a tactics instructor at the basic school occurred during a major expansion of the officer corps, and his lessons on small wars in South America would influence a critical generation of Marine leaders. I think at this point, Chesty was really tired of being a, quote, instructor and trying to teach these young Marines how to be officers or whatever. He actually tried to get on to a seat for the U.S. Army's command and general staff at Fort Leonard Wood, Kansas, but he was actually denied that for some reason. We don't know. After that attempt, he was once again ordered to China, where he arrived in July 1939 and resumed command of the Marine Detachment on the USS Augusta. 1939 opened his eyes a little bit because he realized then that the situation in China had changed dramatically since his first tour from 1933 through 1936. That was because the Second Sino-Japanese War had begun 2 years earlier in 1937, and Japanese armies had seized most of China's ports, as well as a lot of China's main largest cities. I don't know how, but somehow the United States remained neutral in that conflict between Japan and China, and the Japanese initially made little effort to disrupt the lives of foreigners in the Shanghai International Settlement, a treaty port that was under the de facto control of many Western governments, including the U.S. Later on, Puller joined the 4th Marines in Shanghai and was promoted to major in August of 1940. Over the following year, he watched as the German armies consolidated their hold on Western Europe and invaded the Soviet Union. Well, as all this is going on, tensions are rising and increasing in the Pacific, and it became very apparent at that time that military presence in China was a bad idea, so they disbanded a lot of U.S. forces in China at that time. Thus, in August of 1941, Puller returned to the U.S. with a new assignment, a new exciting assignment for the upcoming war that the U.S. is about to be drawn into, and that was with the newly formed and very iconic division and regiment that we know today, the United States 1st Marine Division. Now, whenever the 1st Marine Division was established in 1941, Puller was given command of the 1st Battalion, 7th Marines. After the attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941, the U.S. at last was finally drawn into World War II. That gave Puller his first experience leading American troops in the field after such a long hiatus of fighting himself over 10 years ago. In May of 1942, Puller and the 7th Marines arrived in Samoa to defend against a possible Japanese attempt to sever the sea lanes between the U.S. and Australia. With the temporary rank of lieutenant colonel, Puller spent the following months training his men for the battles that lay ahead in the Pacific theater. Now, the first major Allied offensive of the Pacific War began on August 7th, 1942, with an ambiguous landing on Guadalcanal in the southern Solomon Islands. I may have touched on Guadalcanal in a previous video from a long time ago, but it's a very, very iconic battle in U.S. military and Marine Corps lore, because basically this is the first time that the Americans looked at Japan and said, oh, hell no, you ain't going to knock us down that easily. We're going to get you after what you did to us at Pearl Harbor. And that's exactly what they did. So anyway, Puller and the 7th Marines arrived on September 18th, 1942, to reinforce the still tenacious American beachhead where Puller's 1st Battalion began combat patrols the following day on September 19th. It was during the abortive 2nd Battle of the Mactan-Ikaku on September 27th, 1942, sorry for the mispronunciation, Puller personally orchestrated the rescue of the part of his battalion that had become surrounded after making an ambiguous landing behind enemy lines. Fast forward a month later, he would receive his third Navy Cross during the battle for Henderson Field on Guadalcanal for actions that took place from October 24th through 25th, 1942. He was given this honor because he led his battalion and encouraged them to not buckle under the pressure of the Japanese offensive, and him and his battalion was responsible for holding the line against desperate and determined attacks by two Japanese regiments that were considered critical to the success of the battle at Guadalcanal. On November 8th, Puller was actually wounded by a Japanese machine gun and artillery attack on his command post there in the jungle. In just over 8 weeks on Guadalcanal, the officers of the 1st Battalion, 7th Marines, had suffered a casualty rate of 50%, where casualties among the enlisted men approached nearly 30%. Their strength at this point was basically depleted by both combat fatigue, combat deaths, and disease. And it got to the point where the 7th Marines were actually relieved by an Army regiment in December of 1942. So, after a much-needed respite in Australia, the 7th Marines, with Puller now serving as the regiment's executive officer, landed at, sorry my mispronunciation, Cape Gloucester, which was located in northwest New Britain, on December 26, 1943. It was there where Puller briefly commanded 2 battalions who had lost their commanders in heavy fighting against the Japanese, which resulted in him earning a 4th Navy Cross for his coolness and excellent leadership under fire for both battalions. Fast forward to February 1st, 1944, he was promoted to temporary colonel, and in September 1944, he was given command of the 1st Marines for the assault on Peleliu Island. He was given the toughest assignment, even for a battle-hardened U.S. Marine, and that was to seize the Umorborgul Ridge at Peleliu, which at the time was considered the heart of the enemy's heavily fortified position. In attempting to accomplish this feat, he lost more than half of his men. Now, he did receive some harsh criticism for that battle, but a lot of it was just unjust and misplaced. However, it did stain his reputation for a little while. So after this, he finishes out World War II, a decorated hero, one of the most decorated officers in the entire U.S. military, and you think, hey, maybe I want to retire. He's been in almost 30 years at this point. Well, no, he decides to stick around for a few more years. He would stick around just long enough to serve during the Korean War that started on June 25th, 1950. Whenever that happened, the 1st Marine Division was hastily restored to combat footing to combat the massive waves of North Korean soldiers. It was during that time that Marine Major General O.P. Smith handpicked Puller for the assignment of basically getting the 1st Marine Division back up and combat ready after a slow few years after World War II. It was during the early months of Korea that he would gain more fame and glory. In fact, he led his old regiment, the 7th Marines, in the daring, ambiguous assault on the port of Incheon, which occurred on September 15th, 1950, where he earned a Silver Star for the assault and for participating in vicious street fighting in Seoul from September 25th through 27th, 1950. Now, the Silver Star is still a pretty big deal, and that just adds more credit to his name as being a well-rounded and very likable leader, because he's not the kind of officer or leader that would just sit back and let his men die. No, Puller was down in the trenches and fighting alongside the men that he was commanding, and that meant a lot to the Marines that served under him. He did that throughout his career, especially during World War II and now Korea. Now, after his regiment retakes Seoul from the North Koreans, they would face another challenge in the form of the famous Battle of the Chosin Reservoir, which was famous for its sub-freezing weather and relentless Chinese human waves that were basically trying to pin all the Marines and Army personnel in this kind of fishbowl type area. And that lasted from the end of November to the first part of December 1950. Now, it was for his actions leading and fighting alongside his men where he received a 5th Navy Cross. And just like I alluded to earlier, by him earning his 5th Navy Cross, he became the only Marine in history to earn that many awards for the nation's second highest military decoration. And to make things even more impressive, he was also awarded the U.S. Army's Distinguished Service Cross, the Army's equivalent to the Navy Cross for the Navy and the Marines. For 10 days in late February and early March of 1951, Puller, now a brigadier general and assistant division commander, stepped in to lead the division when O.P. Smith temporarily took over the 9th U.S. Army Corps. Now, Smith and Chesty go back a very long way, and they know how each other are. Smith knew all of Chesty's limitations and helped to keep control of the 1st Marine Division's reserve unit because Puller had a tendency for getting his entire outfit into a fight early. But it was kind of a friendly rivalry for the most part. It wasn't anything serious, but Puller was just very gung-ho, and he was a very gung-ho Marine, wanting all of his Marines to go into battle at one time. Anyway, he serves all the way through Korea until it ends in 1953. For the last couple years of his career in the Marines, it was pretty lax and everything, nothing major or anything. In fact, he retired a full colonel in 1955. Man, guys, I don't know what else to say, but this is very exciting stuff. To start out as a wannabe Army soldier to end up being the most highly decorated U.S. Marine in history, that is no small feat whatsoever. I couldn't imagine fighting and seeing all of the stuff that he saw and all the places he's been through a lot of the 20th century. That must have been very, very impressive, to say the very least. And as you can only imagine through this discussion and all the tales of him serving on the battlefield, he would have a whole host of awards and medals to his name. Now, for a brief summary, all of his awards and medals include the following: 5 Navy Crosses, a U.S. Army Distinguished Service Cross, the Silver Star, 2 Legions of Merit, a Bronze Star, 3 Air Medals, a Purple Heart, 5 Presidential Unit Citation Awards, the Marine Corps Good Conduct Medal, 2 Marine Corps Expeditionary Medals, the World War I Victory Medal with West Indies clasp, the Haitian Campaign Medal, the 2nd Nicaraguan Campaign Medal, the China Service Medal, the American Defense Service Medal, the American Campaign Medal, the Asiatic Pacific Campaign Medal with 4 stars, the World War II Victory Medal, the National Defense Service Medal, the Korean Service Medal, the Haitian Medallo Militaria, the Nicaraguan Presidential Medal of Merit with diploma, the Nicaraguan Cross of Valor with diploma, the Korean Order of Military Merit, the Republic of China Order of the Cloud and Banner with special cravat, the Republic of Korea Presidential Unit Citation, and the United Nations Service Medal for Korea. As you can see, guys, that is a pretty impressive medal and award collection for Colonel Puller. Man, that's very, very, very impressive by any stretch of the imagination. So, after Puller retired from the Marines in 1955, he lived a quiet life in Salota, Virginia. His son, Lewis Puller Jr., followed in Daddy's footsteps and became a U.S. Marine, where he was actually a Marine infantry officer and suffered horrendous wounds after stepping on a booby-trapped artillery shell in Vietnam in 1968, basically amputating both of his legs. Now, his son was pretty decorated too. In fact, Lewis Puller Jr. earned a Silver Star as well as 2 Purple Hearts for his actions in Vietnam, but the side effects were great on him, as you can only imagine. Now, this same son would go on to write a Pulitzer Prize-winning autobiography, The Famous Fortunate Son, as a tribute to his father, who passed away in October of 1971. Puller has had a lasting legacy in the Marine Corps and in the military in general. In fact, he has remained a conspicuous presence within Marine Corps lore, where Marines often invoked Puller's most memorable, although sometimes misattributed quotes to showcase the bravery and tenacity of the Corps, while reinforcing Puller's idealized image as a Marine's Marine. In 1957, in fact, the Corps' official Bulldog mascot was dubbed Chesty, which is a name that canine successors have retained all the way through the 21st century. In fact, in 2017, the Navy commissioned the USS Lewis B. Puller, a forward operating mobile sea base to be used for naval support and special operations missions. But perhaps most enduring, though, is the unofficial lights out slogan of the Marine Corps: "Good night, Chesty, wherever you are." Man, guys, Chesty Puller was a true living legend, and still is to this day. I can't imagine seeing all the stuff that he participated in and fought in, and what kind of example he must have led for the men that served under him. That to me is very, very impressive. If you guys missed my last video, please check it out here. And thank you guys so much for tuning in. In honor of the Marine Corps birthday this week, as well as Veterans Day, Thank you to all of the veterans who have served for our country. You guys don't go unnoticed. And please, thank your favorite veteran this week. I'm sure they'd really appreciate it. Anyway, you guys, until next time, have a wonderful rest of your day.